In the previous episode of Historical Legacy, we told you the story of when Porsche made its brief, low-key, and not very successful entry into the Formula One World Championship. An entry that came and went with little glory and a few major embarrassments. However, in this episode, we will delve into the story of one of the most iconic and successful private teams in the history of Formula One. In addition, this won't be the story of just one or two, but three stories that, although they don't involve the same team per se, do involve the same brand. Ladies and gentlemen, in today's episode of Historical Legacy, it's time to talk about pure Formula One history, about a brand that destroyed all the Formula One teams. Through innovation and led by one of the greatest geniuses ever seen. The story of the top category and one of the most successful teams ever seen in the history of Formula One. That's right, this is the description that fits perfectly with Lotus, a racing team from the era of the garagistes. It was in the 1950s that, thanks to ingenuity, talent, and good ideas, they quickly became one of the private teams with enough capability to beat the big manufacturers that Formula One had at that time. But whose story, despite having ended in 1994, was slightly extended around the year 2010. So ladies and gentlemen, to avoid making this video any longer, welcome to Chapter 4 of Historical Legacy. The story of Team Lotus. Talking to you about the history of three Lotus teams might sound kind of multiversal, the Lotus teams from different universes, but no. It's really the story of three teams that carry the name Lotus, but that existed in two different eras. The first and the main story we'll tell you today is about the private team that was in Formula One since the 1950s, and the other two are the teams that entered Formula One in 2010 and 2011 respectively. But our story is the story of the first team. Lotus began in 1952 and its main character is the British genius Anthony Colin. Bruce Chapman, a British engineer born on May 19, 1928, whose passion always led him directly to fast cars and the racing world. Colin was a pilot in the London University Air Squadron and graduated as an engineer in 1949, but during that time Colin was already working with race cars. And in 1948 he designed his first vehicle, which would be the Lotus Mark I, a car designed to participate in private races. And although it was never really known for sure why he named his first car Lotus, there are many theories about it, and one of them says it was in honor of his wife, whom he nicknamed Lotus Blossom or Lotus Flower. But this was his first car to bear this particular name, and technically the one with which he entered the automotive world. But with this car and its second version, the Lotus Mk2 Chapman began to experiment with modifications, aiming to make the cars more competitive, so the prize money he won in different private races ended up being reinvested in the development of his vehicles. By the early 1950s, Chapman had already built an important reputation as a race car builder, and it wasn't long before he started designing cars for the emerging world championship called Formula One. By 1952, Chapman founded his own sports car company, which he ended up naming Lotus Engineering, headquartered in the United Kingdom. And thanks to all the experience he was gathering by working in multiple categories with sports cars, in 1958 he decided to officially participate in Formula One with his own team and his own Lotus cars. His first single-seaters for his own team were the Lotus 12 and the Lotus 16, which were powered by Coventry Climax, and his first full-time drivers were the British Graham Hill. And the first years of Lotus as a private Formula One team were quite positive despite not having immediate competitiveness. In 1958 they finished 6th in the constructors' standings, and in 1959 they finished 4th, having scored 5 points throughout the season in a start that could be described as slow but progressive. But in just their third season, Lotus would achieve their first official victory in Formula One when Stirling Moss crossed the finish line first at the Monaco Grand Prix. Victory for Lotus in their entire history in Formula One. An achievement that, in fact, he would also repeat in the last race of the year at the United States Grand Prix, where in just their third year in Formula One, they could already boast a constructors' runner-up title. And by this point, Lotus, in addition to having a strong works team, was also supplying chassis to other teams, which was a very profitable business for Colin Chapman, whose success was forcing the team to expand significantly. During the early 1960s, Colin continued experimenting with his vehicles, trying to make them more competitive. And in 1963, he would design the legendary Lotus 25, a revolutionary car that was the first of its kind to use a monocoque chassis, which means it used a single structure and gave the car significant advantages in chassis strength and rigidity, being an extremely rigid car but weighing much less than other chassis on the grid. This was among Colin Chapman's first major innovations. Thanks to this, and with Jim Clark at the wheel, Lotus dominated the 1963 season, achieving 7 out of 10 possible victories that year, giving Colin Chapman, Jim Clark and Lotus the first Drivers' and Constructors' World Championships they would win in their history. They repeated the Constructors' and Drivers' titles in 1965, marking the second crown achieved by both Lotus and Jim Clark. And during that decade of the 60s, Colin Chapman not only dedicated himself to revolutionizing motorsport with his constant innovations, but in fact he is also credited with it. The sponsorship revolution that emerged at the end of the 60s, when Formula One became less restrictive about the sponsorships that the different teams participating in the championship could have. Well, Colin Chapman closed a deal that revolutionized Formula One in economic terms when he signed with the tobacco brand Imperial Tobacco, starting what ended up being the era of tobacco companies in Formula One, which experienced a huge boom from that moment on, until the early 2000s. And thanks to these agreements, Lotus had gained extremely important financial backing that allowed them even more freedom to fully develop their ideas and focus on getting the maximum performance possible from their single-seaters. In 1968, after 2 difficult seasons during a regulatory change that hadn't suited them at all, Lotus arrived on the grid, now powered by Ford, and with the Lotus 49B, a car that stood out greatly for its chassis, which was designed entirely around the engine. And it featured aerodynamic wings that were gradually starting to become a trend in Formula One. Lotus embarked on a campaign that turned out to be a success for the British brand, winning the World Drivers' and Constructors' Championships, which would be the third for Lotus and the second driver's title that Graham Hill achieved in his entire Formula One career. A title they repeated in 1970, and by this point, Lotus already had 4 Drivers' and Constructors' Championships. But it was in that very 1970 when they witnessed the death of their champion George, who died at the Italian Grand Prix that season, although he still had a points advantage. Although he had passed away, he became the first posthumous world champion in this category's history. But this was always one of the main criticisms directed at Colin Chapman and his cars. His vehicles were very innovative, but very often this came at the expense of safety. And many drivers had died or suffered serious injuries while driving his single-seaters, but it was something that many drivers accepted, as they considered it a fair price to pay for having a competitive car with which to fight for titles and championships. By this point in history, Lotus had much larger facilities, a big team full of talent, Ford as their engine supplier, and the backing of a giant tobacco company that provided the team with money. At this particular point in history, Lotus was at its absolute prime, in their golden era, with already 4 constructors and drivers titles, achieving them. By 1972, Lotus was still taking advantage of innovations, and that year they raced with the Lotus 72, which was a concept born in 1971 that took advantage of the aerodynamic potential of the wings in those years, and that brought the concept of aerodynamics several steps ahead of all their rivals. But by 1972, they had a version of this chassis that fully exploited the benefits and minimized the problems that their previous versions had developed. Despite the opposition the Tyrrell team put up that season, no one could prevent this team from taking its 5th Constructors and Drivers crown, but this time it was Emerson Fittipaldi, winner of 4 races, who would have the honor of being the Formula One World Champion in that 1972. However, in 73 things were not so easy, because although they managed to win the Constructors' title, achieving their 6th crown, they lost the World Drivers' title to the Tyrrell driver, Jackie Stewart. In the year 1970, it was the first time in the entire history of this team that they would not take both crowns in a season where they ended up as champions. But regardless of this, by this point they had already achieved 50 victories in Formula One 6 Constructors' Championships and 5 Drivers' Championships. And statistically speaking, they were one of the best teams, not only on the grid at that time, but in the entire history of Formula One. However, after this, Lotus suffered a noticeable drop in competitiveness in the following years, since in 74, 75, and 76, the cars from this team were far from the level of competitiveness that used to characterize them. The Lotus 72 started to become obsolete, and it wasn't until 1976 that they switched the chassis to the Lotus 77, which had a lot of aerodynamic potential but was very limited when it came to suspension. Therefore, the streak of success stopped until 1977 when they were able to win a few races. But that was precisely the season that introduced the last great innovation from this group of Formula One geniuses. During those years, Lotus as a private team was one of those making the most of aerodynamics, but Colin came up with an innovation that would completely revolutionize the effect of aerodynamics on Formula One cars. During the development of the Lotus 78, Chapman detailed in a 28-page document how to improve the car's aerodynamics by modifying the radiators in the side pods, thereby reducing air resistance. But when they tested one of the designs in the wind tunnel, one of the Lotus team designers, Peter Wright, realized that the levels of downforce increased with the design of these side pods, which in theory were supposed to reduce aerodynamic drag. And in these tests, they realized that if the air was redirected through the lower part of the car using skirts and the car was lowered as close to the ground as possible, the levels of downforce increased exponentially. This was essentially the discovery of ground effect, applying Bernoulli's principle. When air passes underneath the car, the effect occurs.
Mucho más que el aire que pasaba por encima.
And the principle says that when a fluid increases its speed, its pressure ends up dropping. And in the car, this created a low pressure area under the vehicle that stuck the car to the track, turning the whole structure into something like a giant four-wheeled wing, which exponentially improved the downforce and with it, the speed of the single-seaters. That whole effect was maximized with the wings that were introduced in 1977, which allowed Lotus and Mario Andretti to win 5 races in that 1977 season. With that aerodynamic revolution they had discovered. And although they couldn't win the titles that year, the following year, with that concept more developed and fully functional, the Lotus 78 and the Lotus 79 brought the brand back to the titles they had lost, and Mario Andretti was crowned world champion in that 1978. And Lotus achieved its 7th Constructors' crown, becoming at that time the team with the most Constructors' titles that anyone had. Which made Lotus the most successful team in that area, only behind Ferrari in terms of victories achieved, but where? By this point, Lotus was already one of the most successful brands in the history of the World Championship, and the legacy they had built was simply and plainly enviable from any angle you looked at it. But that 1978 would be the last time this team would win a world title in its entire career, and that was where the downfall would begin for a structure that had been used to winning and dominating. Formula One. Lotus continued competing in Formula One for several more years, but along the way, it faced some setbacks that limited the competitiveness of its team. Other constructors were developing their own aerodynamic concepts, which were starting to surpass what Lotus had achieved. In addition, Chapman had invested heavily in the development of the Lotus 88, a car that was supposed to compete in 1981 and whose concept was truly monstrous. A car with a double chassis system which was basically one inside the other, where each one acted independently, with the inner chassis, besides having the cockpit, being designed to absorb the pressures of ground effect, while the outer chassis was basically designed to maximize ground effect. And together, these two innovations generated, in theory, an absolutely insane and outrageous amount of aerodynamic downforce, which made them laugh out loud. From the ban on aerodynamic skirts that FISA had imposed in 1981, the year when this organization wanted to limit the volume, it was mostly built from carbon fiber, being the first car to be built mostly with this material. On paper, they had a weapon to dominate and had caught the entire grid's attention, meaning everyone was completely terrified. And this led them to face a Formula One grid that was completely against this concept, which didn't hesitate for a second to go and protest to FISA that this concept developed by Colin Chapman was completely illegal. And due to the pressures from Formula One, and despite having a legal car that complied with everything FISA had written at that time, in the technical regulations of Formula One, this organization ended up declaring this single-seater illegal, and they couldn't use it in 1981 because, supposedly, it had aerodynamic elements that were not firmly attached to the bodywork. With this, they suffered a huge setback in their aspirations, which they would end up paying dearly for, since Lotus was never able to recover in the short term from what turned out to be the ban on the Lotus 88. And during the following years, they had to watch as their competitiveness dropped drastically, and in 1982, Colin Chapman passed away on December 16 of that year due to a heart attack at the age of 54, which completely destabilized the entire team. All of this happened when Colin Chapman was just starting to work on and research the topic of active suspensions. After Colin Chapman's death, the team ended up being led by his wife Hassel Chapman, as well as Peter Eric Warr, who had already worked with the team and had been with them since 1981. But without the guidance of Chapman's genius, Lotus was never able to reign over Formula One again as they had in previous years. They had great periods with interesting victories, especially the one marked by the arrival of Ayrton Senna from 1985 to 1987, but they were never revolutionary and lethal again like they were when the genius was leading the team. And unfortunately, from that point on, year after year, not only did they fail to have championship-winning concepts, but in the end, the great drivers went on to race for other teams. The best engines were with teams considered to have greater potential for success. And in general, Lotus, year after year, lost its position as a team that once knew how to dominate Formula One. The last victory of this team in Formula One was achieved by Ayrton Senna, who, at the 1987 Detroit Grand Prix with the Lotus 99T, managed to win a Grand Prix. With a single-seater powered by the Japanese brand Honda and already featuring an active suspension concept in use, which by 1992 would become widespread. But the following year, Senna and his engine supplier Honda left for McLaren, and this team kept sinking as hard and as fast as the Titanic did in its time. Since the following years were simply the farewell of a giant before its inevitable demise. In an attempt to become competitive again with the backing of a manufacturer, in 1990 they installed Lamborghini engines, but their competitiveness was nothing special. And in that 1990 they also ended up losing their tobacco sponsorship, which at that time was from the company Camel, which painted the cars with that iconic yellow color, causing this team to begin suffering an irreversible financial crisis. The results weren't coming and only the debts remained. The last big bet was the Lotus 109, which was going to debut in the 1994 season, but without money to develop the car, its competitiveness ended up being terrible. They didn't score a single point all year, and inevitably, with the team's financial situation being so delicate. In the end, Lotus ended up going bankrupt, forcing the organization into administration. And this was the final chapter in this story, marking the end of a team that, even in 2026, is still, historically speaking, one of the most successful teams in the history of Formula One. So, after entering administration and being unable to pay its debts, a forced liquidation was ordered, and this ended up causing the team to disappear. The remains were bought and became what would eventually be Pacific GP, which also didn't last long before disappearing. This meant a slow, painful, and horrible death for a team that was always known for being a leader, for being a pioneer, and for knowing how to develop and dominate in a Formula One where great ideas usually ended up succeeding. At least until 2009, because between 2010 and 2015 Formula One saw the return of the Lotus team in two different ways. In fact, in 2011 there were two Lotus teams on the grid. But to understand this story, we have to differentiate these two structures. One is Lotus Racing, founded in 2010 and led by the Malaysian businessman Tony Fernandez, and the other is Lotus GP, which is the team that ended up absorbing the Renault structure when they left Formula One at the end of 2010. And to understand this story as well, you also have to understand that these two Lotus teams had little to do with the Lotus team that Colin Chapman ended up founding in 1958.
58.
Chronologically, the earliest story is Tony Fernandez's team, which started in 2009. That year, the FIA and Formula One had launched a call to add 4 new teams to the Formula One grid to increase it to 13 teams. Due to the pressures and threats the championship was facing with the dispute they had with Formula, 4 teams ended up being selected in that call, such as Campos Meta, which was Spain's project to have its own Formula One team, the US F1 team, which was a failed project by Peter Windsor and Ken Anderson to have a 100% American team. Mano Racing, which would later become Virgin Racing, and the main character of this story is Lotus Racing. Originally, this project was going to be called Malaysia F1 Team, since the owner of this team was Tony Fernandez, who was a Malaysian businessman that wanted to have his own team. But in order to make his entry more attractive and to get the attention of Formula One and potential sponsors, he managed to negotiate with Proton, who owned the Lotus Cars brand, for a license to bring this legendary name back to the grid. And that's how Team Lotus became one of those teams that debuted in Formula One in 2010, although their competitiveness was far from what the Lotus brand once represented. Of the new teams that entered in 2010, they were by far the best prepared and the ones getting the best results that season. They finished the 2010 championship in 10th place in the Constructors' Championship, and they hoped and aimed to grow much more once they established themselves in Formula One. However, the adventure of this Lotus racing wouldn't last much longer, because in 2011 another team, Lotus, arrived on the grid, and that was the one that stayed. Led by Renault Motorsport, after the French brand sold the main team, the new owners of this structure, led by the company Genie Capital, negotiated with the brand Proton, which owned Lotus, to use its name as a sponsorship, founding a second team called Lotus Renault GP. But both teams were completely different from each other, and this situation arose from a legal dispute between Tony Fernandez and the brand Proton, where obviously both entered into litigation over the use of this name. Proton, for its part, claimed that Tony Fernandez had committed blatant breaches in the use of the license they had given him in 2010, and that was why they had taken it away so they could use it in future years, which allowed them to transfer the license to use this name to the former Renault Formula One team. Tony Fernandez, for his part, argued that they had acquired Team Lotus Ventures, the company that remained after the brand left Formula One in 1994, which at that time was owned by David Hunt, and that with this, they had acquired the rights to the brand and the complete legacy of the team. So, according to them, they could use the official name of the team, called Team Lotus. Proton defended themselves by saying that the name was entirely theirs and the property of Group Lotus, which they had acquired previously, and that the use of this name depended entirely on them. Basically, the whole trial revolved around the use of the brand name, a trial that was finally resolved in May 2011, where the court handling the case ended up siding with Tony Fernandez, confirming him as the owner of the name Team Lotus after he had bought it from David Hunt. However, Group Lotus, the company Proton owned at that time, had the exclusive right to use the name Lotus by itself, and with that they could enter Formula One as sponsors of Renault using this name as long as they did not use Team Lotus or Lotus Racing. But since Tony Fernandez broke the first agreement he had reached, acquiring the license that allowed him to use the name Lotus Racing in 2010, he ended up having to pay damages for not honoring this initial agreement. And in the end, Tony Fernandez ended up buying the company Caterham Cars, and to avoid any further problems, they ended up renaming the team as Caterham Racing starting in 2012, which left only one Team Lotus on the grid. The story of this team begins in 2010 when Renault sold
completo su estructura dentro de la Fórmula 1
to simply become an engine supplier for the teams on the grid, but without having a base structure. Genie Capital was the company that held most of the shares of this new team, and thanks to an agreement with Proton, they ended up buying a stake in the team. So the brand was able to make its presence in Formula One in 2012 as a sponsor, bringing back this name and a livery very similar to the one Team Lotus used when they were sponsored by John Player Special. During 2011, they competed under the name Lotus GP, but after Tony Fernandez's team was renamed to Caterham for the year 2012. Lotus would go from being called Lotus GP to being called Lotus F1 Team, since they did not have authorization to be called Team Lotus or Lotus Racing. And the ambitions that this team had were enormous, as they aimed to be a competitive team in the long term, making significant investments in very talented people, actually signing a world champion like Kimi Raikkonen to race with them in 2012. And with the firm intention of being a team that would sooner or later compete for major honors in Formula One. In reality, their time in the category was not bad at all. Their competitiveness was very strong starting from 2012, which allowed them to achieve a huge number of podiums, as well as 2 victories in the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix in 2012 and the Australian Grand Prix in 2013. Their competitiveness was quite solid, and they were only behind Red Bull in terms of pure performance, which was the spearhead in those years. But unfortunately, this team did not anticipate the success they would end up having, and hiring Kimi Raikkonen turned out to be an almost fatal blow that would gradually lead the team into a huge financial problem. Lotus did not expect that level of competitiveness that allowed them so many points in those 2012 and 2013 seasons, as well as several podiums and some victories. Previously, to convince Raikkonen to come out of retirement from Formula One, they offered him a very lucrative contract. It had a performance clause, which said that every point the Finn scored would earn him a bonus of €50,000 to his personal account. So just imagine the financial hit this team would take with the massive amount of points he scored in 2002 and 2013, which is estimated to have been around 20 million euros at the time. This caused the team to have a significant financial shortfall, which even meant they couldn't pay Raikkonen his salary at the end of 2013, leading to a conflict between them because this agreement almost drove the organization to bankruptcy. But even after solving that problem with Kimi Raikkonen's departure, the following years for this team were no better. With the arrival of the 2014 season and hybrid engines, they never managed to properly develop a hybrid power unit. Competitiveness went down the drain in an instant because not only was that power unit not fast, but the car broke down in various ways due to the many reliability problems they suffered throughout the season. For 2015, they switched to Mercedes engines, but things didn't improve much either, although competitiveness did increase a bit that year. But this team was far from the performances seen in 2012 and 2013. Besides, financially, they were not in a good financial position. And Renault, who wanted to return to Formula One to have a better platform to work with, both with its own team and its own power units, decided to buy back the structure. In 2015 and in 2016, Renault returned to Formula One to once again become a constructor team. This ended up removing Lotus from the grid, and since 2015 it marked the departure of the Lotus brand from Formula One. And when was the last time this legendary name was seen as part of the grid in the top tier of motorsport? In conclusion, Lotus in its early days was always synonymous with innovation, great ideas, and how to put them into practice to be competitive and become leaders in Formula One. The guidance of a genius like Colin Chapman, who had vision and clear leadership, was what turned this private team into one of the most successful in the history of Formula One. And although his departure from this world also gradually meant the end of this team as we knew it, Lotus ranks among the greatest teams in the history of Formula One. Even more than 30 years after its last participation in Formula One, Lotus managed to break into the category with innovations that allowed it to leave a historic legacy of 7 constructors' titles and 6 drivers' titles. To this day, they remain among the greatest in this championship's history. It's hard not to feel sorry for how this team ended because they deserved a much more dignified ending than their demise in 1994 and what ended up being the failed attempts to revive it between 2010 and 2015. But it's clear that nowadays, talking about Lotus means talking about brilliance, talent, discipline, success, and above all, one of the best teams ever seen in the history of Formula One. But ladies and gentlemen, this concludes Chapter 4 of the history of Formula One, where we reviewed Team Lotus's history. But tell me in the comments if you knew the history of this team, if you got to see their comeback years from 2010 to 2015. And above all, if you would like to see this legendary brand in Formula One again. Let me know all your opinions in the comments section. Before I go, let me say that if you liked this video, give us a thumbs up, subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications so you know when I'm uploading a new video, and share this with your friends. Please follow us on Instagram and Twitter using the links in the video description. See you soon for more content on your Skyline Racing channel. Thank you for tuning in and see you later.